Hello and welcome to Colred Plays Raid Shadow Legends. I am Colred. Thank you for joining me. In today's video, we will be talking about how to measure progress in Raid Shadow Legends. Now, we all use terms like early game, late game, end game to connote either the personal achievement of a player or maybe the overall progress of an account. We also use those terms to describe the various tasks that we're trying to perform in-game. And the problem with these terms is not that they're bad terms, but that we use them in vague ways. Sometimes we use them interchangeably. And so it can be confusing. Not everybody means the same thing when they say mid-game or late game. So I think it's important to clarify these terms. I'm going to tell you exactly what I mean when I say these terms, and I'm going to try to be as consistent as possible in all of my future videos. That way, not only will you know what I'm referring to when I'm using those terms in my videos, but we can also use those terms as a common ground for discussion in our Discord community. I think this topic is also especially valuable for players who are relatively new to the game, because each of these terms is associated with landmark accomplishments. So knowing what those accomplishments are and looking forward and planning how to achieve those accomplishments or when you might achieve those accomplishments will give players a better sense of the landscape of Raid Shadow Legends and what it takes to be successful at this game, or at least what long-term success might look like to each individual player. All right, I hope I've piqued your interest. Why don't we get started? Before I get going, just a little channel news. Quick reminder that we stream every Tuesday and Saturday, Tuesdays at 2 p.m. and Saturdays at 11 a.m. You can find us here on YouTube. We are also in the midst of a subscriber push. Our goal is to hit 5,000 subscribers by the end of the year. So if you want to help us out, please click the like button, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, and consider joining our Discord community. And thank you for supporting Colred Plays. Okay, right from the get-go, I do want to make an important note. These terms, early game, mid game, late game, end game, can be used in discussions, especially when discussions get heated, to try to belittle or marginalize another player. And I want to make it very clear that I am not trying to categorize anybody. I am using these terms primarily as a measure of in-game progress, not a measure of a player's ability to progress in the game. I don't know you, I don't know what your gaming goals are, and I would never presume to judge you based on your account. So for this video at least, and I implore the community to act this way as well, let's make sure we use these terms only as objective descriptors and not as ways to put people into boxes or to bludgeon them with the state of their account during an argument or a debate. All right, with that out of the way, let's move on and get started with the actual terminology. Okay, so I've made a little spectrum bar here. Basically, there are, I think, 5 terms that we need to be able to use well and understand for describing game state or game progress. The beginning of the game, the early game, the mid game, the late game, and the end game. Now you can see each of these sections has sort of a relative length. This is just my projection of it. It's basically based on my experience with past accounts. The beginning of the game is very short, maybe just a few days. The early game is longer, but again, it's not all that long, maybe a few months at most. And then you have the mid game, which is probably the longest section of the game, and it's also probably the place or the game state where most raid players exist. So the largest portion of the population is probably in mid game. Now, the difference between mid game and late game is definitely going to be the one which is the least clear, and these two states can blend together relatively easily. But I also think that the late game is another long stage. So between mid game and late game, you're probably going to spend 90% of your time in raid in one of these two stages. When you're progressed enough into the late game, you will actually move into the end game. I'm going to talk about my experience in moving to the end game later in the video. The end game can last as long as you want it to. In fact, if you get to the end game and decide your game is then over, this might be the shortest stage for you. Or it can be the one that you stay in indefinitely. Once reaching end game, you might not want to put the game down because you feel like that would be giving up your accomplishments. And so you might enjoy just living at end game indefinitely. But now let's actually talk about the specifics of each of these game states. Okay, so here we are in game state 1, the beginning of the game. Now, I've broken this down, or each of these game states down, into benchmarks and graduation requirements. There are a couple of things that you should know. One is that there's no set standard here. There's no set rules. This is just based on my personal experience. Benchmarks are things that you are likely to accomplish. They are important accomplishments during this game state. The graduation requirements are usually what I think of as the prerequisite for moving into the next stage. If you haven't completed the graduation requirement, you can't really move on. However, it may be that if you've accomplished all the benchmarks but not the graduation requirement, maybe that's enough for you to move on. So there is a little bit of a gray area there. But just in terms of this video, at least, and in discussions in my videos, I'm going to be talking about benchmarks as important accomplishments, but graduation requirements as being absolutely essential requirements for moving out of this game state and into the next. So the beginning of the game is a very short state. And I would say that the benchmarks here are to, first of all, unlock most of your bastion. You're not going to unlock every single aspect of the game. For instance, you don't unlock Doom Tower for a while. You don't unlock the Forge for a little bit, but you will unlock most of the buildings and at least get your base looking like it's fully operational. The second benchmark here is you need to try every available game mode. That means you need to try Arena, you need to try Clan Boss, you need to try all of the dungeons. You need to try everything that is available to you in that early state. Now, some things won't be available to you. Like I just mentioned, Doom Tower might not be available for a while, and that's fine. That's why I say every available game mode. So get into every game mode that you can in the first few days, and you'll start to figure out where you can get resources from, what kind of goals you might want to set for yourself, and where progress on your account actually comes from. Now, I've given an approximate account level for this. This is really fluid. I would say typically the beginning of the game probably stops around level 30. But the single most important thing that you need to do in order to graduate from the beginning state of the game into the early game is you need to get your first level 60 champion. If you don't have a level 60 champion, you can't really be playing the game the way you're supposed to yet. Now, you can have a lot of fun messing around with level 40 and level 50 champions. So if you enjoy that, take as long as you want. But when we talk about early game, we're typically talking about that point after you get your first level 60 champion, and then on up to where the mid game begins. So let's go look at the early game. Okay, so this is game state 2, the early game. For a lot of players, you're going to get into the early game in only a few days. Remember that we said the graduation requirement was just one level 60 champion. Some people do that as early as the second or third day of an account. For some people, it might take 7 or 10 or 15 days. But whenever you get into the early game, these are the accomplishments you're going to start looking at. So probably the biggest one is to get 5 full level 60 champions. Why 5? Why is 5 important? Well, you need 4 for Arena, you need 5 for Dungeons, you need 5 for Clan Boss, and you only ever need 6 for Hydra. So once you have all 5 champions, or at least, your first 5 chosen champions at level 60, then you can really start thinking about approaching the mid game. I've made this a benchmark and not a graduation requirement because I think it's possible to get into the mid game with fewer than 5 level 60s. And I think sometimes some people might have 6 or 7 or 8 level 60s before they're really qualified to get into mid game. The second benchmark here is to clear stage 13 dungeons. You probably have not cleared stage 13 dungeons before getting into the early game. So in the beginning of the game, maybe you were lucky to get to stage 8 or 9 or 10 even, but stage 13 is going to be a nice benchmark for the early game because you're going to be farming stage 13 dungeons a lot. You want to clear your first Doom Tower boss. Now this can be tricky if your first Doom Tower boss is Bommel. That's probably the hardest floor 10 boss to clear the first time. But whatever rotation you're in, you want to get up to that first Doom Tower boss and clear that boss. That should happen in the early game. You might get past several bosses in the early game. Arena is important, and so in the early game, you should be climbing into Silver Arena. If you are still in Bronze Arena, you really are in the beginning of the game. Any 4 or 5 level 60 champions, really any champions at all, as long as one of them is your starter champion, should be able to get into Silver Arena and then start climbing up the ranks. You want to defeat your first Faction Wars boss. You might defeat several. So at least in your starter champions faction, you should beat that Faction War boss and start farming all the faction crypts for materials for the Forge. I would say that the account levels here are approximately from 30 to 55. I think somewhere between maybe like 45 and 60, somewhere in there, you are definitely going to graduate towards the mid game. It's different for different players, but I think typically you're going to need at least level 50 to get into the mid game. But again, these aren't graduation requirements. These are just benchmarks. The graduation requirement for the early game, getting into the mid game, I think the most important one is a 1-key hard Demon Lord clan boss team. Now, Demon Lord used to be an end game accomplishment, and you could measure your progress in the game just by the Demon Lord. But at this point in Raid's lifespan, the Demon Lord is no longer that difficult a task compared to where it used to be, considering the old roster of champions before all of the new champions came out, and before the community had learned everything that it needed to know about accomplishing these tasks. So I do think you need to be at least focused on the brutal difficulty of Demon Lord in order to be a mid-game player. So as a result, 1-key, hard Demon Lord, that's a graduation requirement. The second graduation requirement is that you need to clear stage 16 of most dungeons. I think you should be clearing stage 15 of Minotaur pretty easily, maybe with just 2 champions. I think you need to clear stage 16 of all of the gear dungeons, including Spider and Fire Knight, and those could be difficult. That's why I'm saying most dungeons here, because if you have most of them on stage 16, 17 farm, but one is lagging behind because your roster just doesn't have a solution for that particular dungeon yet, that's okay. And I think you can move into the mid game as long as most of your dungeons are at stage 16 or higher. Okay, so we have graduated to game state 3, the mid game. Now, like I said before, this is the longest stage, I think. This is the one that you're going to be stuck in the most. I think this is also where most players live, and I think probably for a few reasons. One is the mid game is not only long, but it can get discouraging. And so I think this is a place where players quit and come back to the game and quit again and come back to the game, and that can happen. So I think far fewer players will actually graduate from this game state into the late game than get from the early game into the mid game. Let's go ahead and look at the benchmarks. Now, there are a ton of benchmarks for the mid game, and I couldn't include them all. So, if something's missing here that you feel is a clear mid game task, I just wanted to keep the list kind of short. So the first thing that I think is really important is you need to get to stage 20 of all of the dungeons. The mid game is where you are going to need to farm up good gear to help you progress into late game. You are not going to be able to take on those late game tasks without very good gear. You will be building your roster during this point as well, but I think progress in the dungeons is actually more important than accumulating new champions. In addition to the dungeons, you should be able to clear Doom Tower on normal within the mid game. I think that's a big goal for the mid game, and it's a great accomplishment. You're probably going to complete your first fusion here. Now, you don't have to. Not everybody pursues fusions at all, but I think this is the most likely time frame where you will actually try, fail, try again, and succeed at a fusion. I think the big measure here of a successful mid game is getting your 1-key Nightmare Demon Lord team. Maybe you put together your first unkillable speed tune, or maybe you just accumulate such good champions that you can build them in a way to get you a 1-key Nightmare. You should be able to clear your first Faction Wars crypt. In fact, you may clear several Faction Wars crypts during the mid game, while others you're still going to struggle quite a bit with. Hopefully in the mid game, you obtain your Arbiter. Now, I thought about making this a graduation requirement, but I don't think that's quite fair. I think you can get into the late game without Arbiter, but I do think she makes it a lot easier. So some players may get their Arbiter in the late game. Some may even get her in the early game, but I do think the most common place to get your Arbiter is in the mid game, and it is a very good accomplishment and an important accomplishment for mid game players to consider. Again, we started probably around level 55, and we're moving up to some other level. Now, this is where the differentiation between spenders and free-to-play players really happens, because a big spender may enter the late game at level 60, or even the end game at, say, level 70, whereas a free-to-play player may struggle even up until level 80 or 85 before they get into the late game. But for most of my free-to-play accounts, what I find is somewhere in the 55 to 75 range is where I accomplish all of my mid-game tasks, and as I approach 75, I'm going to start thinking about my graduation requirements. In this case, those requirements are a 3-key Ultra Nightmare Demon Lord. So at that point, typically you're going to have your 1-key Nightmare Demon Lord, and you're going to have your 3-key Ultra Nightmare Demon Lord, and that is a key component to moving into the late game. Remember, this used to be the end game, but it is no longer the end game. There are much harder tasks than Demon Lord now, but Demon Lord is still important because it's the best place for you to collect resources like shards and tomes. Finally, I think it is a graduation requirement to get into gold 4 or 5 arena or higher. It is possible, although really difficult, to say farm gold 2 indefinitely and build up your Great Hall in that fashion. But I think realistically, to consider yourself a late game player, you must be successful in arena, and you must also be successful in 3v3 arena, and you probably even want to get into live arena. I didn't want to put all of that down because I think the most important one is classic arena, and that's where your focus should be. But in order to really graduate from the mid game to the late game, I think you have to have a successful arena team that is at least in gold 4, getting the maximum number of gold medallions for the Great Hall every battle that you can. Okay, so once we accomplish those 2 big tasks, we will now move into the late game. Here in the late game, which is game state 4, we have several benchmarks. There are actually a lot of benchmarks here as well. But again, this is where it gets a little bit blurry between mid game and late game. I will say that during the late game, you are probably clearing all stage 25 dungeons and starting on your hard mode dungeons. That feels like a late game task to me, not a mid game task. So I think those 2 benchmarks are spot on. It's possible to obtain your Mithrala during the mid game, and she may help you get into the late game. But I think for most players, getting Mithrala is a really big moment, and that typically happens in late game. But she's going to then help you get a lot of other benchmarks as well and push into end game. I don't think you can actually get into end game without Mithrala. I mean, you could. Some people did before Mithrala existed, but it would be very difficult at this point in time. Now, if you just don't care about Mithrala and you want to get to end game anyway, that's a judgment call that you can make. But when I reference end game accounts or end game goals in my videos, I'm going to be assuming that those players have already obtained their Mithrala. Another important benchmark here is a 1 key Ultra Nightmare Demon Lord. Again, I think if you're still stuck on a 3 key or a 2 key, you can get into the end game. It's just harder. The faster or easier you can complete your Demon Lord, the more time, energy, and focus you'll have to spend in other places, and the more resources you'll be getting from your clan boss chests. As far as account levels are concerned, this is roughly 76 to 95. I actually feel like I got into the end game slightly before level 95, so I probably did it somewhere around like level 93, but I think this is a pretty good range for late game accounts. Again, if you're a spender, you may get to the end game faster, but for a free-to-play account, I think around levels 90 through 95 is when you're going to be graduating from the late game into the end game. And so we come to the graduation requirements. The first one here, I think, is an absolute. You must obtain Lydia. You cannot consider yourself an end game player until you have obtained Lydia. Now, it's great to be a late game player. You can exist in the late game forever, and you might not be particularly motivated to build all the teams you need to complete all the faction crypts and get your Lydia. And that's fine. And you can take on end game challenges without having your Lydia, and that's fine. But I don't think you can actually say I am at endgame until you have your Lydia. And I think the second one is likewise a very important graduation requirement, and that is to have Doom Tower hard on farm. Remember, the end game is the very end of the game. It is the very hardest challenges, which means the challenges just before that need to be accomplished before you can really focus on those most difficult of challenges. So I think obtaining Lydia and having your Doom Tower hard on farm are very good markers for progress moving from the late game into the end game. Now, the 2 other graduation requirements are just more sort of personal landmarks that I would say coincide with graduating to the end game. And the first is to have a 1 key Brutal Hydra. At end game, you are going to be focused on Nightmare Hydra. That is the end game fight. It's the hardest fight in the game, maybe Fire Knight, hard mode level 10 is harder. I don't know. It depends on your roster and your perspective. But this is meant as the end game clan boss fight. So that has to be end game, which means Brutal is the late game fight, right? Because once you get past Brutal, you are now into Nightmare Hydra clan boss, and that is an end game fight. In addition, I think somewhere around this phase, you're going to get 3/4 of your Great Hall done. So there are 240 levels of Great Hall. So you're going to get past about 180. I would think you'd probably have to be higher than this, maybe 190 or even 200 to really start considering yourself endgame. You need all of those stats from the Great Hall to really help you accomplish a lot of the late game and end game tasks. So until your Great Hall is developed most of the way, you may have trouble accumulating the stats on your champions you need to move into endgame. Okay, and finally, we are here at endgame. Like I said, this could be just a few days for some players, or it could be years for other players, depending on how they view existing and playing at the endgame. I think some important benchmarks will happen at the endgame. For instance, you will start clearing stage 10 of the hard mode dungeons. You could do some of those in late game, but I think realistically, this is an end game task. Another thing that you're going to do is you're going to get a full auto team for the Maximum Iron Twins, Maximum Sand Devil, and Maximum Phantom Shogun dungeons. A lot of people wait on those anyway. Even late game players may not do them very much because they don't feel they are very rewarding. And therefore, if you're just trying to check all the boxes and accomplish all of the hard tasks in the game here at endgame, these would be some of those benchmarks. Finally, you're going to get to account level 100. Now, you might actually get to level 100 in the late game, but I think you have to get to level 100 in order to be considered at endgame, or at least during endgame, right? Like you could start at level 95, but the goal is to max out your account. So at endgame, you are going to max your account. I almost made this a graduation requirement, but I really don't feel it's critically important. But you're going to be close to 100 when you enter endgame, and you're going to finish it off if you keep playing. Now, the graduation requirements here are kind of funny to me because how do you graduate from endgame? You don't. But if you want to think of these as win conditions, these are 4 ways you could say, hey, I have won Raid Shadow Legends. There's nothing left to accomplish. The first one is complete your Great Hall. Get up to level 240 in your Great Hall. That is an amazing accomplishment. I'm still not there. I am an endgame player, but I've probably got a few more months before I can potentially complete my Great Hall. That is one of the longest standing tasks, the most time-consuming achievements in the game. So to complete your Great Hall is probably one of the best feelings I can imagine in Raid Shadow Legends. It's weird because it's just a grind. It's not like, accomplishing a fight that you had to build a team for. It's literally just, are you committed enough to get all of the medals or medallions or whatever they're called to complete your Great Hall? But when you do it, that's a win condition. You have finished something that very few people have finished in the game. Another graduation requirement could be One King Nightmare Hydra. This is the end game boss fight. So if you have beaten the end game boss fight with just 1 key, preferably on all affinities or all rotations, then you are definitely an end game player, and you can not only say you're an end game player, but you have basically won the game. You have beaten the hardest fight there is in all of the game. That looks like winning to me. In terms of PvP, I would say reaching Platinum Arena could be considered the end game. It has gotten harder and harder to reach Platinum Arena, so some people may get to endgame and never ever reach Platinum Arena. I have only ever entered Platinum Arena twice, and I've never finished the day in Platinum Arena. And I haven't tried in like 8 months. So don't feel like you need to accomplish this one, especially if you're a free-to-play player. The new mechanics in the game, the empowerment system, mythic champions, the awakenings and the blessings, all of those mechanics are making it harder and harder for free-to-play players to even consider getting into Platinum Arena. So if you're a free-to-play player, feel free to just cross this off the list. But if you have reached Platinum Arena, if you exist there now, congratulations, you've also won the PvP game. And finally, one graduation requirement, which I think most people will pass on, is obtain Ramantu. So once you complete your Arbiter missions to get Arbiter, there's a whole nother set of missions that go all the way to Ramantu. Some of the other benchmarks at these game states in the mid game and the late game, I didn't even mention, because basically they are requirements for you to get Ramantu anyway. So for instance, you're going to need to get into Gold 3v3 Arena. I didn't put that as a benchmark, but if you want to obtain Ramantu, you need to do that. You also need to collect a bunch of Doom Tower bosses from Doom Tower Hard, all the secret rooms. I didn't mention the secret rooms at all, but again, if you are going to say that you've won the game by completing the Ramantu missions, you're going to have to hit all those benchmarks along the way. I feel like I've personally just entered endgame in the last couple of months. I still have a ton of benchmarks to go. I still have a ton of graduation requirements to fulfill. I don't know if I will ever complete them all. For instance, I don't think I'll ever reach Platinum Arena. But I do have the goal of completing my Great Hall, One King Nightmare Hydra, and hopefully obtaining Ramontu. That for me would look like winning Raid Shadow Legends. Okay, well, I hope this has added some clarity to this terminology. I hope it also gives us common ground for moving forward, whether you are just watching my videos or we are having discussions in our Discord community, or even if you're having discussions in your own clan community outside of Colred Plays. I also hope this has provided insight for you early game and mid game players to understand what's ahead of you and maybe some of the things that you want to focus on to move into the later stages of the game. If you think I've missed anything, please put that in the comments below. If you think one of my definitions is really off or one of my graduation requirements isn't fair, also let me know that. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and consider joining our Discord community. And also join us during a live stream, whether that's Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern or Saturday at 11 a.m. Thanks so much for joining me. I've been Colred, and I will see you in another video soon.